On a night when the sea burned, the horizon was a living bruise. A destroyer rolled in the black water, radar lit like a fever dream. Crews watching green arcs sweep and return with too many echoes. The first engine howl was a thread, then a roar, then a hailstorm of wings. Pilots with the sun painted on their foreheads, flying toward death as if into a mirror. Tracers stitched red ladders into the sky. A young sailor felt the ship shudder beneath him and thought, without words he could name, that he had arrived at a doorway none of them should have to cross. On land, there was a hill that looked like a burial mound. Nothing special if you didn't know its name. Beyond it, a city of stone and coral and memory. The first bullets snapped over the boys' helmets, and the earth answered old bones. Old shells in the limestone singing their brittle chorus as shrapnel worked them loose. Smoke draped the ground. A medic crouched behind a coral knob and tied a tourniquet with hands that had once held church hymnals. He could hear someone praying across the ridge and didn't know if it was Japanese or American, only that the voice was asking to go home. They called Okinawa by many names. The Typhoon of Steel, the last and the worst. Some letters spared the censor's pencil by vagueness and metaphor, used an image the men couldn't shake. A gate. The last gate before Japan itself. The last gate before the end. And because of what it cost to force it open, they sometimes called it Hell's Last Gate. This is the story of why. It begins with maps and planning tables and ships so numerous that the water looked like a city had sunk and risen again with masts and flight decks. The United States 10th Army, soldiers and Marines together, aimed at the Ryukyu Islands, a string that curled toward Kyushu. Okinawa, long shaped by its own history and culture as much as Japanese rule, stood in the middle of Allied strategy in 1945 like a keystone. Whoever held it owned airfields that could choke Japan's lifeline, harbors that could anchor the armada for invasion of the home islands. But Okinawa was not empty space on a chart. It was fields of sugarcane and villages of coral walls, families who had weathered typhoons and dynasties and the weight of empire, now bracing for a storm like no other. On April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, and April Fool's Day at once men waded ashore on wide beaches under a quiet sky. The stillness shocked them. Stories had spread from Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima beaches, where men died by the hundreds before the surf could dry on their uniforms. But here, on Love Day, they crossed sand and took 2 airfields before noon. Yanten, Kadena. They looked over their shoulders, uneasy. It felt like being waved through a door. They should be locked. It was a trap made from caves and patience. The Japanese 32nd Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ise-jima, and spirited on by his volatile Chief of Staff, General Isamu Cho, had dissolved into the earth. Their headquarters was under Shuri Castle, a seat of Ryukyuan kings. Their guns were zeroed onto the hills the Americans must cross to reach them. The beaches were left as bait. The killing ground lay in the south, in ridges with names the Americans would learn by bleeding on them. Kakazu, Takeshi, Sugar Loaf, Half Moon, Horseshoe, the Maeda Escarpment they called Hacksaw Ridge. That first night, sailors stitched the sky with fire, and Marines stared into darkness that felt like a living thing. The sea surged. The island breathed. Somewhere, a bell in a temple that had outlived 3 kingdoms and a dozen storms lay buried in rubble, waiting. Why call it Hell's Last Gate? Because it was the final doorway before an invasion no one in the fleet actually wanted, and because opening it revealed a chamber of war where the rules bent and the earth itself burned. Over the next 82 days, men would learn what it meant to fight in a place where civilians huddled in caves like coals, in a hearth where pilots used their bodies as weapons, where storms turned battlefields into mud-laden graves, and where a hill taken in the morning could devour you in the afternoon and spit you back out by nightfall with a different face. Before the last shot, a general would die, a palace would fall, a battleship would vanish in steam, and a phrase would settle like ash over too many letters home. We've reached the last gate, and it leads to hell. If the beaches were a whisper, the north was a lullaby with knives hidden in its folds. The 6th Marine Division fanned out across the island, weaving through fields where goats watched and dragonflies skittered over flooded paddies. The coral ridges in the Motobu Peninsula rose like a spine, each vertebra a potential ambush. The mountain called Yidake to the Marines wore a crown of scrub and caves, a perfect place from which to slice at an advancing line. It was there, in that knot of stone and green, that the North announced itself, as if saying, "Do not mistake me for mercy." The Marines took it, ridge by ridge, cave by cave, with grenades pushed into the mouths of limestone, with flamethrowers that turned air to liquid heat, with satchel charges that rattled chests from the inside. Behind them, the Navy ground its anchors into the ocean floor. Ahead of them, the island narrowed. Off to the west, Haishima sat low in the water, its airfield a stubby tooth that had to be pulled. It was on that small island, under a sky bright and indifferent, that Ernie Pyle fell. The war's most famous chronicler of ordinary soldiers died with his head cradled in a ditch, killed by a machine gun burst. His readers back home imagined his last notes, imagined him reaching for his pencil. For the men on Okinawa, the loss made the air feel thinner. If even the man who gave words to their days could be erased, what did the days mean? But the story of why Okinawa was called Hell's Last Gate is not written in the north. It is scrawled in mud and coral in the south, where General Ashijima's army waited behind a defensive belt around Shuri like a crouched beast. He had learned from the butcheries of beaches earlier in the Pacific War. Instead of throwing men against sand and artillery, the Japanese would stay low, endure naval bombardment inside caves, and then climb back to their guns. The earth would hold the bullets. The hills would hold the line. American generals soon realized that the easy landing had been a mirage. To pry open the southern door, they would have to commit everything manpower, machines, valor, patience, and accept that much of it would be swallowed. Major General John Hodges' the 24th Corps pushed south on the left. On the right, the Marine 3 Amphibious Corps advanced. Between them, the Shuri Line waited, a labyrinth of reverse slopes and interlocking fields of fire, of tunnels that connected machine gun nests in spiderweb patterns that allowed defenders to vanish and reappear like angry ghosts. Hacksaw Ridge was a teacher with a cruel lesson plan. On the slopes, men discovered that reaching the top meant nothing if the enemy had gunned the far side for your silhouette. They crawled under fire from mortar, tucked into caves, from snipers who let them pass and then shot them from behind, from artillery so well hidden that the first warning was the crack and the spray of coral, dust, and bone. The ground was pitted with Tombs family vaults, where the living and the dead shared space in a war nobody had invited. Families had waited for the storm in these ancestral shelters. Fighters drilled holes in their doors. Then there was the Maeda Escarpment, a sheer face like a broken tooth, so steep the men named it Hacksaw Ridge. They went up on ropes under fire that seemed to come from the stone itself. Men fell back and tried again. A thin, quiet combat medic named Desmond Doss climbed into history there. A conscientious objector who refused to carry a weapon, he pulled wounded men from the lip of the escarpment like a fisherman hauling in the last catch, lowering them hand over hand, alone, under fire. One more, he told himself. Another. The number he saved made math feel holy dozens, then beyond counting, until his arms shook and the night closed over the ridge. For that devotion to life in a place committed to death, he would become the first conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor. But heroics, even luminous ones, could not change the arithmetic of Okinawa. The ridges held, the gate resisted. The civilians were caught in it from the first day in the south. Okinawa had a language and a memory that didn't always match mainland Japan's. Now posters and soldiers told them to die rather than surrender, to fear Allied soldiers as devils. Some civilians were handed grenades and told to use them on themselves if capture loomed. Some were drafted into work battalions, hauling ammunition or water through fire. Families dragged bundles and toddlers from field to field, from cave to cave. In the dimness underground, stories flourished like mold. Americans would torture them. The Japanese would shoot them if they stepped outside. Mothers carrying infants learned to hush them with a palm pressed over a small mouth while the jungle scraped at the cave mouth and the air filled with fuel. The Americans dropped leaflets. Loudspeakers told the Okinawans the truth as they understood it, that they would not be harmed if they gave up, that medical care waited, that there was food. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes a family walked out and was led to a trench, fed water, wrapped in blankets. Sometimes the family was shot by their own side for leaving the cave. Sometimes they came out clutching a white cloth and were caught in the misfire of terror the moment produced. The rain came in mid-May, as if it had been ordered for the battle, and the battlefield changed again. Water filled the foxholes. Weapons grew slick and unreliable. Boots, never dry, wore holes in the flesh beneath. Licorice-thick mud swallowed jeeps. Corpsemen wrapped trench feet and gently pulled off socks that peeled skin with them. The island smelled of wet canvas, oil, and rot. The men inched forward anyway, hands on each other's belts in the downpour, the only direction that had meaning straight toward the fake horizon, where Shuri Castle was more rumor than objective. Each hill they took was another hinge in the gate, rusted and shrieking, and the handle was still out of reach. While Marines worked the hinges inland, the lock was guarded at sea and in the sky, and that lock had teeth. The Japanese called the waves Kikusui floating chrysanthemums. 10 massive kamikaze offensives, layered gut punches designed to bleed the Allied fleet white. They aimed first at the pickets, lonely destroyers and small support craft strung like beads far in front of the armada, their radars casting frayed circles into the darkness, their orders to see the storm before it broke and shout a warning so others could brace. Those picket stations became shrines to bare survival. On April 12th, the USS Laffy took up her prayer on Radar Picket Station 1. The enemy found her with a fury that would make a lesser ship disappear. Dive bombers screamed in, followed by Zeros full of humans turned into warheads. The ship's gunners fired until their sleeves smoked, until the deck ran slick. A kamikaze hit the after 5-inch mount. Another slammed into the fantail. Bombs punched through the superstructure. The Laffy burned and kept fighting. In the end, she had been struck by 4 suicide planes and hit by as many as 5 bombs. She listed. She spit smoke. 32 sailors lay dead, 71 wounded. And still she floated, earning her nickname the ship that would not die. That was one day. The sea wrote dozens of such entries in its log. On April 6th and 7th, the first great Kikusui rolled over the fleet like a black tide. Destroyers disappeared. Landing craft split and sank. Rescue boats, men meant to save the drowning, found themselves targets and survivors at once. In the midst of that storm, the last hope of the Empire's blue water pride sailed from Japan. The battleship Yamato, the biggest in the world, set out with meager escort and just enough fuel to reach Okinawa, not to return. Her mission was madness as opera. Beach herself, become an immovable gun platform, die in place wreaking havoc. She left the inland sea, wearing her name like an epitaph. American carrier aircraft found her in open ocean. Waves of helldivers and avengers dove through clouds, bombs and torpedoes falling with hideous grace. Yamato threw fountains of flak into the sky. A torpedo struck the port side, then another, then a cascade. Her bow lifted, Her heart surrendered. The great ship rolled and tore herself apart with a geyser that rose like a mountain. Over 3,000 sailors went with her into the cold. The ocean closed, smoothing itself as if nothing had been there at all. For the men off Okinawa, that distant column of smoke was a sign. Even the symbols were dying. The empire would kill itself to gain a minute more. The carriers fought their own private war above the landing beaches. Ordnancemen pushed bombs across hot decks. Pilots climbed into cockpits with mascots stuffed into their suit pockets, rabbits' feet, coins, pictures of faces that made their hands steadier. They rose and launched and rose again. Sometimes they did not come back because Japanese pilots riding their engines like spears crashed through deck parks and set the world on fire. On May 11th, a kamikaze punched into the USS Bunker Hill just as her flight deck teemed with fueled planes. A second struck seconds later. The deck exploded into a bouquet of fire. Gasoline flowed into the hangar bays and ignited. Planes melted into serpents of aluminum. Men vanished in a white heat that stunned the body before it realized it was dying. On the bridge, smoke ate orders. Below, men crawled through dark rooms that had become ovens, their hands groping along bulkheads that scalded fingertips. The crew fought for their ship with hoses and buckets, in bare will. When the fires shrank to memory, 346 sailors were dead, 43 missing, and 264 wounded. The Bunker Hill did not sink, but something in the fleet's heart tipped and never regained its level. The USS Enterprise, a veteran that had lived under more bombers than some cities, took a kamikaze in May and finally had to leave, as though even names grown mythic had to be humbled by this new form of war. Ushered into the line, the British Pacific Fleet carriers with armored decks steamed steady, absorbing hits that dented metal, but not resolve. Their presence, under Task Force 57, was proof of a world gathered to pry open the last gate. Americans, Britons, New Zealanders, Canadians, Dutch, and Japanese across from them, not monsters, but men obeying orders that asked of them everything, offering to their families a stone and a memory in exchange. The Sea War had another layer, quieter and constantly murderous. The radar pickets were joined by small ships SS and LSMRs, tiny workhorses bristling with rockets, firing into the sky as though they could draw a roof over the men on the beaches. They drew fire instead. The water around Okinawa became a cemetery for ships and aircraft, and a school for survivors who would talk the rest of their lives about smells wet rope, hot paint burned flesh, and about the color of the sea when it is full of things that should be ashore. In all, more than 1,500 suicide aircraft hurled themselves at the fleet. 36 American ships were sunk. Hundreds more were damaged, some scarred so deeply they would only limp to a final berth. Over 4,900 sailors were killed, a number that made the Navy's bill at Okinawa the highest of the war. Above, where the air got thin, fighters clawed at each other in dogfights that looked like schoolyard scuffles from the ground and like tiny wars from inside the canopy. American pilots learned the trick of turning kamikazes in the last seconds. Japanese pilots learned that some parts of the sky were filled with bullets and spitting fire. Pickets learned to watch the sun, the direction most kamikazes preferred to dive from. Everyone learned to watch everything, because the attack could come as a glint over the wave, a whisper in the headset, a sudden tilt in the world, and a heat in the face no wind could cool. Those at sea began to speak of the island with a new kind of fear. Okinawa wasn't just a battlefield now. It was the hills around Shuri clawed at time. Days felt like weeks, weeks like years. The men measured progress not in yards gained, but in tombs passed in the number of trips from front lines back to ammunition dumps, in the count of times they'd written a letter, then watched the rain dissolve the paper because there was no dry to be found. They fought for ridges so small they couldn't be recognized on a map, and learned their names the same way people learn the names of those who've hurt them. Sugar Loaf was a low, sloping mound. It should not, by any law of war or physics, have mattered as much as it did. But it sat under the guns of Shuri like a plug in a drain. Taking it meant prying out a piece that kept the water from moving. The 6th Marine Division attacked and took it and were pushed off. They came again and were shoved backward by mortar shells and machine gun fire that reached into their helmets like a hand. The enemy used the ground as a weapon, channeling men into ravines that looked friendly and slaughtering them at the bend. Half Moon Hill and Horseshoe Ridge completed the panorama, a trio of interlocked killing fields that forced the Marines to invent names to match the shape of their grief. In the foxholes and coral crevices, the men became chemists of survival. Cigarettes went out in cupped hands. The sound of a canteen unscrewing could cost a life. They learned to read the sky for breaks in the rain that might allow movement. They learned the language of artillery, the difference between incoming and outgoing, by the curve of the sound alone. They learned to carry the memory of a dead friend like a stone in a pocket weighty, always present, sometimes grounding, often unbearable. In these weeks, the act of lighting a flamethrower and sending its tongue of fire into a darkness was both tactic and penance. The blowtorch and corkscrew methods, flame, and explosives to drive defenders from caves worked. They were also passages into a kind of moral fog in which doing what must be done felt like tearing at the fabric of what made you human. The caves themselves were worlds. In some, nurses worked by candlelight. The Haimiyuri student nurses' teenage girls pressed into service, moved among the deer. Wounded watched the roof turn to stone rain under bombardment, and sometimes understood that their lives, too, were to be spent as part of a defense they had never been allowed to question. In other caves, families huddled. Children quieted themselves into stillness that would concern their parents if the world weren't ending around them. Once in a while, an American patrol lifted a curtain of grass and found faces staring back. The fear in them something that had nothing to do with uniforms and everything to do with the pounding rhythm of death all around. Some soldiers lowered their guns and handed out rations and words they hoped were comforting. Some followed orders to clear the cave as if it housed only combatants, because the cave often did. The Japanese defense began to slide, not to collapse, but to slowly pull away from its anchor points. Shuri Castle, that red-tiled symbol of Ryukyuan history, which had been burned once centuries before and rebuilt, wore camouflage as if it could fade into a hill. Beneath it, headquarters hummed. When the Americans finally broke through the surrounding heights, they found the castle empty, the defenders having stepped backward in the night. The empty rooms betrayed the distance between the thing and the meaning of the thing. The place mattered less than the line of caves and ravines now further south. The army fell back toward the rocky pocket around Yeju-dake and the cliffs of Mabuni. The gate had a second door behind the first. It was made of the same stone and rules. The rains reached a crescendo, and the island swam. Tanks bogged in clay that clenched like a fist. Shermans fitted with flamethrowers, their nozzles gaping like the mouths of prehistoric animals, belched fire across drenched fields, the steam a pressure cooker's scream. The men moved under ponchos that trapped sweat and fear, and they learned to tell each other jokes that were not funny but needed telling. The Marines' command shifted because death had reached into the top ranks. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. Commander of the 10th Army, stood in a forward observation post on June 18th close enough to feel the world's breath and was killed by a fragment from a shell. He became the highest-ranking American officer to die by enemy fire in the war. His death came like an exclamation mark written by the island itself. No one was exempt. In the south, the battle became a harvest. Admiral Minoru Teitie and his naval contingent held the Oroku Peninsula west of Naha after a spectacular nocturnal amphibious, counterstroke Japanese sailors landing under the nose of the fleet inflicting and absorbing punishment in equal measure. When they were overrun, Tite wrote a final report using the language of history, praise for Okinawans' loyalty and a sorrow for their fate. He and his staff then took their own lives in a cave, leaving behind words that would be invoked decades later as both tribute and indictment, depending on who spoke them. On the last ridges, the Japanese army folded into itself. General Ashijima, calm and respectful, and General Cho, intense and unpredictable, argued about whether to spend the army in a last, useless attack. Ashijima refused to order men to die for nothing, and chose the ritual of surrender without surrender seppuku, near Mabuni on the night of June 22nd into 23. They went with the old words on their tongues, the blade and the witness offering proof that they had reached the endpoint of a code. Their soldiers continued to die for days in pockets, snipers firing alone in the sodden dark. Between the ebbing lines, civilians came out like damp ghosts. The numbers do not stop hurting when you repeat them. 1/3, perhaps as much as half, of the pre-war population of Okinawa was gone, mothers and infants, elders and students. Schoolgirls of the Himeyori unit blown apart when caves were dynamited. Sons who had been drafted into Boitai labor units bled out beside artillery they could not even lift. When the guns fell silent, it wasn't silence at all. It was the rattle of stretchers, the coughs of men in field hospitals, the unexpected songs of birds that had refused to leave. The island had been chewed and scarred. Shuri Castle was gone, not for the first time in its long life. Entire villages existed only as outlines where walls had been. On the airfields, the Americans had taken that first day. Stacks of equipment testified to what would be next repair, logistics, the construction of a forward base. But among the helmets lined up for cleaning and the rifles stacked against them was a different inventory. Memory, moral calculus, grief. The numbers made headlines back home. A phrase, "Hell's Last Gate," made sense not as poetry, but as geography. Okinawa was the last island on the road to Japan that American planners felt they could not bypass. Here, in a limited space, the full reach of modern war had been displayed like a hand of cards laid face up. Suicide tactics in the sky. Flame on land. Civilians turned into human shields by command and into neighbors by mercy. The earth turned to weaponry. The rain made everything worse. If this is what it took to push open the last gate, what would it cost to force one more to invade Kyushu, then Honshu? In Washington, the men who read the reports shivered in the heat of summer. Planning for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan was already on drafting tables. Casualty estimates wandered from horrifying to impossible, depending on who leaned on the calculations. But even the low numbers stacked high. Hundreds of thousands of American casualties, perhaps more. Millions of Japanese dead, perhaps more. Okinawa had shown what a single island could do to those who fought on it, what it did to the minds of those who watched the dead hauled from the surf. It became not just a precedent, but a warning. The decision that followed would reshape the century. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 carried with them 1,000 arguments. Veterans of Okinawa read the headlines with complex hearts. Some said, openly or behind the curtain of sleep, that the bombs spared them from crossing a sea covered in black wings. Others looked at photos of melting cities and saw a different gate opening. Between those poles lay the ache that Okinawa had planted, knowledge of what the world would do to win, and the creeping wonder if there might have been another way. We cannot resolve that for them. A documentary can only lay the pages side by side and ask the viewer to hear the dry crackle of paper turning. For Okinawa itself, the war did not end with the last shot. American occupation brought new roads, new bases, a long military presence that would outlast empires. The island, once again, became a gateway this time for planes and missions in later wars, a place where uniforms were as common as tourists' shirts. In 1972, Okinawa reverted from American administration to Japan, and the island's memory complicated, as it always does when identities overlap and history will not choose a single label. Memorials rose. In Itomen, the cornerstone of peace set names in stone without discriminating nationalities, inscribing the fallen in the geography they shared in death, if not in life. The Himiri no T stood for the schoolgirls. The ruins were rebuilt. Shuri Castle stood again, red-tiled and confident, before fire reclaimed it once more, in 2019, a separate loss that felt like an aftershock. The American veterans came back when they could. They stood on Sugar Loaf and scraped soil into hands that had steadied rifles. They walked through reconstructed castle gates and felt time ripple. They talked to families whose grandparents had hidden in caves while their own fathers fought inches away without ever seeing each other. They stood together, often silent. Okinawan elders told them what it had been like to listen to papers lie and to a radio murmur, a world collapsing. And the younger generations of both places tried to listen without flinching. Why you soldiers called Okinawa Hell's Last Gate comes down to something more human than strategy. It was the feeling that the war had gathered everything terrible it had learned and put it into one place, saying, "This is your last test." It was the realization that the next gate beyond this one would lead not just to Japan, but to a kind of abyss from which it might be hard to return with your humanity intact. Many who survived carried the gate with them, its hinge grind in their ears at night, its heat in their palms, the faces pressed against it as they pushed. A call to action, if there is one, is not a slogan. It is a quiet request. Remember Okinawa not only as a stepping stone in a campaign or a line in a strategy textbook, but as a place where fields grew, where music sounded in a different tongue, where people had a way of greeting the day before soldiers turned it into an argument. Remember the destroyer on the picket line, the pilot who steered himself into steel because he believed that leaving this world that way served something larger than himself. The medic who lowered one more man over the edge, with hands already torn to the bone. The mother in the cave who wanted to believe a leaflet and trembled when she couldn't. To study a gate like this is to ask what it means to pass through anything by force. We inherit the world they made on each side of it. We inherit their choices and their pain. Honoring them can mean more than laying a wreath. It can mean seeing the shape of the next gates we build with our politics and our fears, and choosing which of them we can afford to open.